Hello. So it's May 2022, and we're still here, we're still on planet Earth. Still watching the planets as they appear to travel around us in the same path that the sun appears to travel around us in the zodiac. Pluto's getting very close to the tail end of Capricorn, when Pluto, that planet of power and control and life and death, makes contact with the other planets, changes houses, changes signs in the zodiac. It is certainly a huge shifting time of change for us humans. Pluto, the planet of power and control. People who have power and control. People who have the power of life and death. These are the issues that draw a great deal of attention as Pluto is shifting signs, and it will be doing so in March of next year, entering Aquarius, getting close. And certainly this war in Ukraine is a big manifestation of it. Today I wanted to look at Putin's chart and Germany's chart to see what's going on with the transiting planets there, because the story is there in the repeating patterns of where this war is going and how it will evolve and when will it end. All wars are incredibly destructive, and this winter could be rough. Mars will be retrograde. During the same period, they're busy fighting a war. Putin. Well, we have transiting Saturn traveling here in his chart. Uranus is traveling here. Jupiter and Neptune are traveling here, and Pluto is here. What's been highly noticeable this year in Putin's transits is transiting Saturn. It came very close and entered the fourth house. This is the house of one's land, one's home, one's residence. And he seems to be clearly after the land itself of the Ukraine, thinking of it as land belonging to Mother Russia. But Saturn opposite Pluto in his birth chart, Pluto, that planet of war and power and control, at the very top of his chart in the birth chart, indicating indeed a person in this lifetime who would be a person of power and control. Saturn opposite Pluto kicked into effect as Saturn entered that residence, and that was March, April of this year, just as this war started. Now Saturn's going to be retrograding and going back out into the third house, barely, but it will do so. And then it's going to re-enter the fourth house. And this is going to take place at the end of the year. And there'll be a dramatic surge, presumably, where he will make a last-ditch attempt or do something of extreme nature in pushing this war forward. There are surges, clear periods, where it looks like he's moving forward, where he's very, very focused and determined mentally. For example, Saturn trining Mercury. Saturn traveling along at 22, 23, 24 degrees of Aquarius these last 2 months. Perfect trine with his Mercury, which says determined, persistent, mentally focused in a very determined way on a specific goal and sticking with it. This is Saturn trining Mercury. At the same time, Saturn opposite Pluto engaging in this war, and Saturn squaring Jupiter, the planet of prosperity and bounty, so not in fact doing very well compared to what he would hope to do. But this war keeps going on, and this repeating pattern here of Saturn trining Mercury continues. We see it again in January, February of 2023. So this again will show another great determined push there. Uranus comes very close to hitting his birth Jupiter in August of this year. So there may be some close situation where the war almost ends, or he has a challenging moment, or things are shaky, very shaky when Uranus hits Jupiter, but it doesn't quite make it. It turns retrograde and backs off. And it's May of 2023 that Uranus will be precisely on top of Jupiter, and some major dramatic changes will be taking place in the circumstances of his government and the circumstances of his own prosperity level at that time. And what we also see is transiting Neptune squaring Mars. We're seeing a square develop here, a 90-degree angle between transiting Neptune and Mars in 2023 in his chart. And this will be again in May, just as Uranus hits this Jupiter. Neptune starts squaring Mars, and that's very debilitating. When Neptune squares Mars, the Mars being the planet of one's action, one's activity, one's assertiveness, Neptune debilitates it when it squares that Mars. So we see very challenging circumstances forming in his chart, and we no longer see that determined mental perspective after May of 2023. But in July of this year, a surge. And then again in October of this year, when Mars turns when Mars turns retrograde. Maybe that's wishful thinking. Mars, the planet of war, the planet of aggression, the planet of action, fires, explosions, weaponry. When Mars is retrograde, it is inevitably a time when it's usually war and battling going on, or challenging circumstances on the planet. So with Mars retrograde from October of this fall right through until January, the end of January 2023, this winter could be rough. But next year, Neptune squares his Mars, Saturn squares Jupiter, and more importantly, Uranus finally makes a conjunction with his Jupiter, and everything changes in his chart next year. And it does not look like it's changing for the better in any stretch. So one can be optimistic that potentially this war is coming to an end there. So now here I want to show you something going on in Germany's chart. Germany has been more or less dormant in terms of war and aggression and weaponry, of course, since World War II. Now, Uranus is traveling along, having a good time here, having a good time with my little magnets. Transiting Uranus for the first time since this country started, and we're assuming that this particular chart and this version of Germany started in 1949. This is when this republic, this German government of circumstance at present began, 1949. And this is how the planets were arranged. Now Uranus has taken all of this time, 70 years plus, 80 years plus, to get to the point where it is conjunct Mars. And that's happening, interestingly enough, this year. First time since this started, since that war. And Mars is weaponry. Mars is fighting and weaponry. And Uranus is going to activate Mars in Germany's chart this year. In fact, it starts in July. And it continues on until October. And then it comes back again next year. As well, we see something going on with Pluto in Germany's chart. Pluto's traveling here. Uranus is traveling here. Jupiter's in their third house. Saturn is in their financial house, interestingly enough. So they're going through some financial stress regarding this oil, regarding their fueling system, regarding all of the weaponry and money they're scraping up to give to the Ukraine. But what's also notable here, as well as this activation of Mars in Germany's chart for the first time since they started after World War II, we see Pluto making contact with Jupiter, a conjunction with Jupiter, and trining the Sun. This is empowering. This says they are becoming very powerful in the world. So certainly self-independent. They're not going to be dependent on Russia or anyone else. And they're going to start becoming far more powerful. Again, that is in 2025. 24 and 25 actually. But this activation, precisely on time, is interesting, and again kicks in precisely between July and October. So it certainly will be interesting to see what's going on with this war and with people of power and people of control from July to October. And then even more importantly, here we have the US of A. We're going to talk about power, and we're going to talk about control, and countries have to take a look at the USA as well. What we have here what we see here is Saturn getting very close to the moon, which will actually make contact next year, 2023, in the spring, in February. Something very sensitive activating there, the month of February 2023. But it's this Pluto conjunct Pluto that's relevant to this focus today. This occurred in the USA's chart, planet of power conjunct the planet of power at birth for this country. Of course, that's taking place this whole 2-year phase period, and they're going through quite a transitional shift. But that's another story. But this Pluto, planet of power, conjunct the birth Pluto in the house of money in the US of A. That was activated for the first time this spring, March, April. Just as they demonstrated their power with all of these sanctions and decisions made in terms of economics and giving away billions of dollars to the Ukraine to fight Russia. Now what's really interesting is the planet Mars is going to be retrograde, as I have been explaining, and it's going to stop precisely conjunct Uranus on the edge of that 7th house, the house of war, in the USA's chart. Transiting retrograde Mars will be conjunct Uranus, the planet of explosions, conjunct the cusp of the 7th house, the house of interpersonal interactions with other countries. And that is going to lock in for the last week in December and for all 4 weeks of January 2023. So something extreme is going on in January, February, in Germany's chart, in Canada's chart, certainly in the US of A's chart, in Putin's chart, and in Biden's chart. There are very challenging things going on in his chart, especially in February. The other thing we look to see what's going on with wars and circumstances of this nature, repeating patterns. Transiting Saturn is traveling along in Aquarius right now. It was in Aquarius when the Berlin Wall was put up. It was in Aquarius 30 years later when the Berlin Wall came down. And it was in Aquarius when Russia, the Soviet Union, excuse me, dissolved and fell apart and became Russia. And Saturn is in Aquarius again right now. And it will be there until March of 2023. So this date, March of 2023, is clearly a very significant time for us to be looking at in terms of huge shiftings going on in this world. I've heard some astrologers talk about the potential that Pluto people, these despots, these dictators, these powerful old men usually, these despots, that after Pluto, the planet of power, transitions into Aquarius, the planet of freedom, that we will no longer see that these fellows are out there in the world. They'll just fade away somehow. I'm not so optimistic. I think certainly they'll become dominant in our focus, and possibly we'll see a resurgence of old men trying to become powerful old men, dictators and despots and autocrats, like Donald Trump, for one. He's another example. Putin, lots of old men. And they may manifest in a big way as Pluto slowly shifts into Aquarius. Someone else was pointing out recently that Aquarius is also the sign of craziness and eccentricity. And if you look at the history, when Pluto last moved into Aquarius, as it will in March of 2023, and as at the same time that this war seems to come to peak and finally be resolved, in the past, when Pluto moved into Aquarius, there was the American Revolution. We're talking mid-1700s. And the leader of the huge portion of the world, the British Empire, the king became crazy or mad. Mad King George. So we may have a lot of old power-tripping, egomaniac men trying to go to war and becoming more and more eccentric and crazy. No, those are extreme potentialities. But we can all observe together, if we're still here on the planet. You probably will be. I'm not so sure about myself. Take good care. Be aware there's so much going on beyond the surface of things. And this powerful focus of Pluto in our lives right now, as it slowly gets forward into a position of shifting signs, it will become more and more dominant. Issues of life and death. Shortages. Suffering. No fuel. Wars and fighting over fuel. Wars and fighting over water. These are all natural evolutionary products. When we are focused on killing and war and energy is being utilized in such a terrible way. But there we are. Take good care. This war will end. And Pluto is getting older. Pluto, indeed. And Putin is getting older. Take care.